Well, welcome to Bible Live. This is episode 102, and the title for today is this: How do we think biblically about bodily autonomy, personhood, and the life of the unborn? In June 24th this past year, the US Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade ruling, which means that individual states in the US now have the authority to decide how to legislate on issues of abortion. It sparked a great deal of protest, new protest in the US and also here in the UK too. Around about the same time, June 21st, the UK government reported that the UK's highest ever rates of abortion for the year to June totaled 214,869. That is one every 2.5 minutes. And this past week, on Friday 23rd of September, in fact, at 11:41, the total number of abortions in the UK since it was legalised in 1967 hit 10 million. And I know that some people observed a minute's silence for that. So we've been planning to talk about this issue really for a number of months now. So I've assembled a panel of guests. June's with us, Linda's with us, Tom's with us as well, which is tremendous. And we're going to try and separate up the issues here a little bit. And you can see that a little bit in the title for us. So we're thinking about bodily autonomy. What does it mean to have bodily autonomy as Christian people? What constitutes personhood? We're thinking a lot about personhood, especially when we're thinking about the unborn. And that will follow on from last week's Bible Live, if you caught that. And then how might that inform our decisions around the life of the unborn and around a pregnancy? And then finally, if we get time, it'd be good to think through how we then project this thinking and theology and how we think as Christian people into the world. What do we expect our government to do? How do we expect our government to make laws? How do we expect things to be done in wider society? What should we say? What should we do? How should we act as Christian people in the world? So these are all really sort of interesting questions. I hope you'll track with us in the coming few moments. But I think it's important to have a few preliminaries. We appreciate this is a sensitive topic. June, perhaps you would just help us here. We want to know safety in the love of Jesus at this point, especially as we come across things that may be very personal and very real for people listening in. June, do you want to just help us think about the love of Christ at this moment?
Yeah. So we're talking about all of this, and whatever people's experiences are, that all happens under the loving and merciful eyes of the Lord. And I think people may be watching, feeling like they're carrying secrets even that other people don't know, but the Lord knows, and he doesn't reject us. His forgiveness is incredibly powerful, and he's accessible to us. So I absolutely would be encouraging us all to hold that in mind. And also, as we think through this, perhaps our perception is that this will impact non-Christians and not Christians, but actually there'll be people in our churches who will be impacted by this, who may have decided to have an abortion, or certainly been grappling with that decision. So I think it's just helpful for us to be kind and compassionate to one another as we're thinking through this. That it's not nearly as clear cut, I don't believe, as perhaps we like to think it is. So I think it's helpful just for us to remember the nature, the character of God. And if, as people are watching it, they feel a bit kind of triggered by it, don't feel like you need to sit here watching it in discomfort. You can go away and come back at a later stage, or if you find it too difficult, just leave it, or do something to help yourself with your self-care. So grounding exercises, things that are going to connect you back to the here and now, so that you're not so triggered that you're back reliving old trauma.
Absolutely, and I think it's worth saying, isn't it? This is a Bible Live episode. It's a podcast. We can't deal pastorally with people on a podcast, but we can one-to-one. And it might be that following up from this, you might actually want to speak to someone face-to-face and talk about this issue. There are plenty of people, whichever church you're a part of. If you're coming at this from Southend and you're part of Christchurch or St John's or St Michael's, there are wonderful people in the ministry teams of all the churches who would gladly sit down and pray with you and walk through things with you, which is a much better way to deal pastorally with some of this stuff. But let's talk about bodily autonomy first of all. Why don't I give us a scripture here, and then maybe we can sort of riff on this for a moment. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 19, which Linda, I might come to you first of all. Let me just read it. This is the Apostle Paul. He says, this is on the topic of sexual immorality. He says, flee from sexual immorality. All of the sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Linda, give us an opening thought on bodily autonomy. To what extent, as Christian people, redeemed and bought at a price, as it says there, do we have authority over the bodies that we inhabit?
Well, just reading Paul's scripture, I've kind of highlighted the words in my Bible, you are not your own, kind of suggesting that we're not our own, so refuting bodily autonomy. And when I was looking at this scripture this week, I was thinking things like, can Christians claim bodily autonomy over themselves with in mind of this scripture? Do we own our own bodies? And if we do, how do we value them? And then the most profound thing I thought of this week when I looked at that is when we die, our bodies turn to dust, but we remain. So all of those things were kind of wrapped up in my thoughts really around that. And when you kind of look at a basic definition of bodily autonomy, this is a definition from one of the dictionaries, the concept that an individual has solely the right to control his or her own body and what happens to it. So I kind of see these two things, a little bit of tension between that definition and Paul telling us that our body is not our own. So that's kind of where I started on my journey of looking at bodily autonomy. So I had more questions than answers, really. So I kind of throw it out to you guys, and especially my last question, when we die and our body returns to dust, but we remain, what does that do with then, like the bodily autonomy, really?
Tom, do you want to help us with that? Tom, do you want to sort of touch on that and what roles our bodies have, the importance and significance of them in relation to maybe us as our, in our soul, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I really like what Linda was saying there. I mean, I think bodily autonomy, there's some certain aspects that's really good about that, isn't there? That it prevents others feeling like they can have a say over your body, or violate you in some way. You can say, no, each of us, I think Christians uphold that we are individually precious to God and every person is created equal and all of that sort of thing. So you can't just say others in society have rights over my body. We do have bodily autonomy in that sense. But I think what Linda's saying absolutely is right, is that actually, but each of us belongs to the Lord, especially Christians, obviously, who give our lives to the Lord. We are one with the Lord, and he has purchased us with a price. He, with his own blood shed and his own death, he has purchased us. He's redeemed us. He's almost like brought us back from our captivity and slavery, and he's united himself to us. And so we don't have that kind of autonomy that you might think, a right to do whatever you want with your own body, because it does. And that's not a bad thing. The Lord cares for us and wants to look after our bodies. So it's not a bad thing. But I think in terms of what Linda was saying about what happens, obviously our bodies when we die, they do get turned to ash and dust to dust, ashes to ashes. But let's not forget the resurrection, of course, which is the truth is that one day our bodies will be raised. That same dust, whatever nature it's become by that point at our resurrection, will be raised, and God will, bring back our bodies. So they are eternal, and they have a future. So although we remain, our souls and spirits remain when our bodies go to the ground, and our spirits go to heaven to be with the Lord, they will be reunited again at some point in the future. So I think even then our bodies still belong to the Lord, as well as to ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we turn to Jesus on these topics, don't we? And if I'm looking at Jesus, when I'm thinking about bodily autonomy, even that's an interesting one. There he is, the Son of God. And in his life, exercises, is obviously making choices, is doing things, is operating with a certain amount of freedom. But in the end, especially when we approach his trial and crucifixion, he is yielding himself there, isn't he, to the will of his Father in that amazing prayer in Gethsemane. Of all prayers, he's there saying, okay, this isn't the way I would want to do it. In a sense, this is going to be tremendously difficult, but I'm going to say, not my will but your own. I mean, that in itself is a tremendous example for us, even as we think about this issue. June, do you want to chip in there?
Yeah, I was just thinking, when we're thinking about as Christians saying that we're not our own, I would want to be really clear there that we're not saying, therefore we don't have bodily autonomy and anyone can do anything, much like Tom was saying. Actually, when we're talking about I belong to God, I belong to Christ, and that's why I don't have bodily autonomy, that's a safe thing. That's really different from I don't have bodily autonomy because somebody else has taken control of my choices and my body and forcing me to do things I don't want. That's very unsafe. And many people will experience that. When we're talking about God being in control, that's safe. That's not to suggest that he's going to prevent all suffering from our lives, but the control of God over us rather than us having control over us, that should provide safety. We should be able to rest in that safety, connect to that safety. So it's just to kind of contrast, that's very different from losing control to people who are going to harm us.
Yeah, go on.
Interestingly, like the church has historically viewed taking your own life as a sin because it wasn't yours to take. Your body, your life belongs to the Lord. He gives life and he takes away. I know we're not necessarily going to have that conversation at the moment, but that is an interesting way that the church has always said, look, that's the ultimate expression of bodily autonomy, isn't it? To say, I can do that with my body if I want to. And Christians will say, no, it belongs not just to you, but to the Lord.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and I think that gets us into it, isn't it? It's that sense of, I think it's a helpful distinction that, yes, we want to, the worry, I suppose, for people is that somehow evil will be imposed upon me and I will have someone who's doesn't have the best in mind for me is now taking control, and that's going to be very bad for me. But I suppose as Christians, we're starting from a place, aren't we, of the Lord is good. He wants the very best for those. He's working all things for the good of those who love him. And somehow, as we work out what God's will is in all of this, we know that it's good and it will be best for us.
There's also that slight feeling in our culture that as long as whatever you're doing has no impact on anyone else in society and in the privacy of your own life, everything's fine, because that's, again, your own autonomy. That's your life. That's your thing. And again, I just don't think the Bible looks at things that way, that we do impact each other, whether you think it or not, what you're doing in the privacy of your own room, but you also could be harming against yourself and against the Lord. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm adding too much in here now.
No. Well, points well made. Okay. Well, there's some opening thoughts about bodily autonomy, and we may sort of loop back on some of that in a moment. Let's think a little bit about personhood together then, because one of the issues when we're thinking about an unborn human is at what point are we considering them to be persons made in God's image? So last week we talked about the image of God and us being made, humans being made in the image of God. Now, the debate then comes in, well, at what point are we considering an unborn life as a person made in the image of God? That's sort of challenged some theologians and others quite a lot. some opening thoughts on that? Who wants to go first?
Shall I jump in terms of
Yeah.
we're thinking about, when does life start? Is that what we're kind of wanting to? So, I mean, one of the arguments that I've heard, and I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but I think it's an interesting thought, is, Adam came to life when God breathed life into him. So is there a suggestion that someone is only alive once they are breathing air? That's quite different from, arguments that we would hear, about life starting from the point of conception. Another interesting thought that I've come across is there's a passage in Exodus 21, so this is Old Testament law, and it's talking about a situation in which if two men are fighting and a woman who is pregnant gets in between them to try to break up the fight, and in doing that she gives birth prematurely, that there are two cases. If there's serious injury, then there's a problem. If she gives birth and there is no serious injury, so if she might miscarry but there's no serious injury, then it's just a fine. So, but if the woman dies or there's serious injury, then it's life for life. So that there is a suggestion there. And again, I'm not saying that this is what I'm kind of building my understanding of this issue on. I just think it's interesting that it is in scripture. There does seem to be a suggestion that perhaps there's a difference between a very early unborn child and a child who's nearly at full term. As I say, not saying that this is therefore, we can all change our minds on what we think about it. But I suppose I think it's just helpful to see that there are, even within scripture, there are different ways of looking at this. I don't think it is as straightforward as we want it to be sometimes.
No, that's really helpful, and it makes a valid point. There seems to be, it's still something wrong, I guess, in that case, in the Exodus passage. There's still something happened that's not good. Even if a baby in utero is being harmed, I appreciate there's a sort of a degree in which the scriptures are handling the situation there. But why don't we just have a look? Shall we just rehearse maybe some of the biblical passages, some of the material that inform us about life in the womb? We could think about Jesus. We could think about John the Baptist. Linda, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just, Psalm 139, which I'm sure we would all turn to. It's just a couple of things, really. In verse 13, for you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. And then verse 15, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. And then this key one, really, verse 16, your eyes saw my unformed body. And then it goes on, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So just in terms about this, the unborn status, pre-born, reading those scriptures, the Lord is involved, isn't he? From just at that level, doing the work that he does before any cells have even joined together. The Lord is there, and his eyes see the unformed body. But it's very, very profound words, very well known, but I think and very profound, yeah.
And written at a time when we didn't have ultrasound and we didn't have the sort of the cameras and technology that we have now. So even our eyes can appreciate an unborn human life in the womb as well. But I guess when that psalm was originally penned, that was a bit of a mystery. It was very hard to imagine or think what that might have looked like at the time. So precious thoughts in the psalm there. Tom, do you want to walk us through maybe the incarnation or John the Baptist and the way the scripture sort of seems to speak about unborn life in those scriptures in the Gospels, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all those passages that have already been mentioned are great. There's so many examples in the Bible of the Lord knowing someone before they're born, whether that's Jeremiah or John the Baptist, There are examples where the Lord say, I knew you. And furthermore, there's even more than that, because the particular one with John the Baptist and Jesus is that I love the Luke chapter 1 example where Mary, who's just become pregnant with Jesus, goes and visits Elizabeth, who's, I think, further along the line, maybe another 3 or 6 months pregnant. I think she's 6 months pregnant by that point. And Mary and Elizabeth meet each other. And of course, their two bumps meet each other too. And Elizabeth notices that John the Baptist is leaping in her womb. And that because he's in the presence of what Elizabeth says is her Lord. Her Lord is now present inside Mary. Now, remember, Mary is possibly only a few weeks pregnant here with Jesus. And that John the Baptist is already relating to Jesus. So you've got this relationship between two unborn children, unborn babies, unborn life, that is relating to each other. And I think that's extremely profound, because we can get into arguments about, is it when the breath of life comes into us? Is it when the baby first moves? Is it when all these things, when does life enter? But the thing is that what's fascinating is you can have relational life, related life to these, when you're unborn. And I think, and God himself, I think the classic case we really need to think through is the incarnation. When did the Son of God become flesh? When did he become incarnate? When did he leave heaven and become one of us? Was it at his actual birth? Was it when he started to move in his mother's womb? No, I think we would have to theologically say he became flesh at the moment of conception. At least that's what my understanding would be, because I think that's when even biologically speaking, we know that, if you want to get biological about it, a sperm and an egg you could treat as just parts of the man or the woman. Does that make sense? Independent part. Then that's not a new life. That's not a new being, a new living creature. But as soon as a sperm fertilizes an egg, you've got a situation where actually that is not now either the man or the woman. It's something new. It's something that's totally brand. Yes, it's totally dependent on the woman at that point, and that's an important aspect to remember. But it is a new life, and I think the Bible supports that. There's loads of examples. King David would talk about the fact that he could be a sinner, that he could be sinful from the moment from the moment he was conceived. That's an important aspect, that we are considered part of the human race from the moment of conception, because we've inherited a sinful nature. So I think what we can't say as Christians is that a fetus, or whatever language we're using, is only got the potential of human life. I think we want to say it is a human life that has potential, and see it that way. Right? Does that make sense? I think otherwise we're getting to a very slippery slope of when does something become a human. That would be the wrong way to look at it. I think it's more like it might be a different kind of human life, but it is human life. And that then therefore extends not just to preborn life, but to all kinds of human life that we come into contact with post-birth. There's all sorts of different sort of stages and characteristics of, we're very different, aren't we? And it's very dangerous to go in the line of saying, well, that's ceased to become human now. Or that's whether we're conscious or unconscious, whether we've got certain disabilities or differently abled, or very old, with dependent on machines. Do you see what I mean? So we could become dependent on machines at some point to stay alive. Does that mean we are no longer human because we're dependent again? Anyway, sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
That's really helpful. And we even say in the creeds, when we're thinking about Jesus, in the historic creeds, we say he was conceived by the Holy Spirit. There's this idea that it was at that moment, his conception there, with under the work and operation of the Spirit of God, that we're reckoning on Jesus coming amongst us. And then I like what you were touching on at the end there, Tom, which is also what we were talking about last week, and it was the idea that it's actually not so important how functional someone is. So we know about abortions can go to full term in the case of severe disability or illness, and also in the case where the mother's in danger and things like that. But just thinking about that case of where someone's actually severely disabled or has a very degenerative disease or something like that, we're still saying, aren't we, as Christian people, we're saying that is still 100% a human life to be valued and made in the image of God from the moment that baby was conceived. We are still, I think, affirming the fullness of God's image in a child, no matter what they're able to do, how able-bodied or how or not, or whether they're diseased, or very unwell, very ill inside the womb. I think it's good to affirm those things nonetheless. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say. I think that legislation is interesting because it doesn't. The kind of thing that perhaps we think about when we think about, being very disabled may not actually be. So, for example, somebody who experiences Down syndrome, could live a very fulfilled life, could have a job, could live independently, could be married, could raise a family. But that life could be terminated right up to the point of birth because of Down syndrome. So it's not that we're saying at that point only people who effectively might live in a locked in kind of state where they're not able to communicate, or we're not saying that at that point. I think it all becomes very difficult, and I know many disabled people really grapple with the fact that legislation is in place because it suggests that some lives are worth more than others. Like we're all equal, but some are equal a bit more. That's not right, is it?
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think we've certainly got some agreement in terms of we appreciate and understand the importance that the Bible places on unborn life, and maybe that's something to think about, ponder a little bit more in the episode. But let's move on. We can keep folding these issues back into the discussion, but if I can move it on ever so slightly. So how does that then bring us to some sort of decision-making process for us as Christian people? Let's just think about us as people who we're not our own. We belong to the Lord Jesus. As Christian people, how does that help us then inform us and make decisions around whether to continue or end a pregnancy? Linda, do you want to feed things in here that we might be thinking about, particularly on that issue?
I think we all appreciate how difficult I think this issue would be as a Christian person. I think June mentioned it earlier that just because we're Christians, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't find ourselves in an awful situation where we are grappling with the decision as to whether to end a life or not. That can happen, and I'm sure it does happen. And just in my experience, I've had these conversations with people. I don't think when people come to see us, and I think June and I have both come from counselling backgrounds, we are very well trained in not giving advice or a solution. So, when I think about that, we know how to give that back to the person. We know how to reflect those words back. We're trained to do that. And I'm trying to think, like, if I was in a pastoral situation, I probably would apply some of those same counselling skills. But I think it would be really hard. I don't think people are coming to us necessarily for a solution, but they're coming to maybe want to be heard. They want to share the story and for us to listen with some kind of advanced empathy rather than seeking a solution. And so I think that's all I would like to say on it, really. I think people want to be heard, and we're there to have this advanced empathy. We haven't walked necessarily in their shoes. None of us, may not have walked in that person's shoes. And I'm always holding that in my interactions with people. I haven't lived your life. We were given an example we talked about earlier, that if somebody came to see us and they'd maybe been gang raped or something, and this resulted in a pregnancy, and they present themselves at church or with one of us, what do we do in that moment? And for me, I would really want to be coming alongside that person and just trying to listen and listen really, really well, albeit we've not experienced that, these are really, really tricky things, and I don't have a glib or straightforward answer to it. One thing I would say is that one size does not fit all. You can't be trained for the right kind of reaction to something like this, So I don't know, June has had lots of experience with people come in that have been raped and all sorts of things. We've heard this, and the trauma, to see someone traumatized and in front of you, it's so difficult. June, what would your view be on that?
Just picking up on something you said there, if we are talking about sexual violence or domestic abuse, so gender-based violence, I think it's really important to recognise they've already lost control of their body. We need to be really careful that what we're doing isn't then triggering them to, right, what I'm suggesting is that you carry on with something whereby you continue to lose control of your body. That's what you must do. Otherwise, God won't love you anymore. And I know that we wouldn't approach it quite like that, but we need to be really mindful of just how triggering the loss of control of what's happening to our body if we've been through a sexual assault, that feeling that we must continue on with a pregnancy will connect in with that trauma. I think my kind of stance on it, if I was coming at it from a pastoral perspective rather than a counselling perspective, would be to say, look, I can only hope that in that situation I would aim to carry that baby to full term, but I'm not going to stand in judgment and tell other people that they must do that. Things are very difficult. Was in a lecture over the weekend, and we're actually talking about communion and what happens if different things go wrong during like a high communion. And someone was saying, what happens if you spill loads of the wine everywhere? And the lecturer quoted a well-known bishop. And he said, he comes from a very high Anglo-Catholic perspective. And he says, life is messy. That's what you've got the purifier for. You don't need to. Life is messy. And I think that is absolutely true. And we have to, like Linda was saying, we have to kind of walk alongside people in those situations. I guess one of the things that I might flag with somebody is to say, we have to think about what would happen in both perspectives. I might want to sit with somebody and say, let's think through what would happen if you made this choice. Let's think through what might happen if you made that choice. Because I don't think abortion is the easy choice. I think it's very difficult. It's a very traumatic experience in and of itself, particularly if it's later on in the pregnancy and you're actually having to give birth to that baby. And I think it stays with women. I think many of the women that I've spoken to who have had an abortion will say, I think about that child every day. And so that's something that a woman will be carrying with her if that's the choice she makes. So I think exploring both sides of things is important.
Thanks, June. And I think, Tom, you made a point a moment ago about, separating out issues maybe doctrinally and pastorally. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
I think what's been said is absolutely right in the sense of course, there's one thing when you get some horrendous situations and they're very real and probably a lot more common than we think. And I know June would know that a lot more than some others, but and I think when we're pastors and we're dealing with all of life's horrible evils and mess, and it's very difficult. But I think that is different from the church itself having doctrines around, theologically speaking, what is sin, what isn't sin, what can be the solutions, what's not right, those sorts of things. And I think we, as a church, it's okay to have doctrines. And we need them, absolutely, because it gives the framework of which we operate in the mess. But given that the Bible also acknowledges that there's a lot of mess and mistakes, and divorce might be a good example. We might say, look, divorce is something that is not in part of God's good creation, but the Bible has to deal with the reality of broken relationships and mess. I think where I would go pastorally, and again, I highlight again what Linda and June have been saying, that I've not walked in anyone's shoes in these situations, and is that absolutely, I would not want to load someone up with the possibility of condemnation, because then someone could be doing something for causing a lot of damage. But what I probably, in my mind at least, would be thinking is that I don't think abortion would be the solution. Having said that, if someone ended up making that choice, I would also understand how difficult that must have been, and perhaps there's no condemnation if they, acknowledged the difficulty of that. But I think in my mind, I would be saying, look, as best I could, I would hope to think we could spend some time with that person, trying to show the evils of what's happened to that person, but that the unborn life should not be held responsible for that. I'm not saying that that's what they would be saying if they did end the life, but we need to try and see that as like, look, there's this life has an innocence as well, and that needs to be factored in, and that also that taking that life is not necessarily going to solve the problem, or even I would try and get them to see actually that would be I wouldn't want to use the word sin necessarily, but I think it is it's looking at something, trying to correct a problem or a difficulty by committing something that is also not right in God's eyes. Having said all that, the church must and has to offer extraordinary, if we're going to say something like that, we have to offer also extraordinary support in terms of what it would look like to help that person if they were to carry the baby to term. We would have to show we can't just say someone, mustn't do this, you've got to do this, and off you go. You might need to take that person away from their family. They might be under threat from their partner or whoever, or you might have to take on that child for adoption, or you might have to financially support that. But all sorts of things might be required if you're going to say, I don't think that abortion's the right solution here. Sorry, I think that's where I'd go pastorally. I think I'd find it hard to say you've made the right choice if you ended up terminating the pregnancy and killing the child.
June, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I guess, I think for the most part, Tom, I would agree with you, but I think there are situations where, there just isn't an answer. Like, whatever the answer is, it's awful. If we're saying to somebody, and I'm conscious that I'm perhaps focusing in very much on gender-based violence, and lots of terminations, of course, are not to do with that, but I suspect a significant number are. What would it be like for a woman to have to feel that she has to carry the child of a man who did the most horrific, degrading things, and that every time she gets undressed and she sees that lump, she thinks again? That every moment she's there's something that's within her. She's had something within her she didn't consent to, and now she's having to carry this thing within her which she didn't consent to. Just must be the most horrific thing. And so, whilst, like I say, if I were in that situation, I hope I would behave in the way that I would want to. But it's very, very hard to say to somebody in that situation, no, you need to go through 9 months of having that inside you because of what was inside you. That's an awful, awful prospect for somebody. So I just think sometimes these things are very, very difficult, very traumatic, very painful.
Can we?
That's
go on, June. Sorry, Tom. Go on.
No. And I think that is probably a very important. Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is I think if someone's trying to work through the decision and they've come to me for that, I would like to say I'd take a different approach. I would take an approach there that would discourage ending the pregnancy and trying to understand a way that we could make this work. But it would be different if someone came to me afterwards and says, this is what I've done. Because of this, I've done this action. Then I think that's the point where I would say, okay, that was an incredibly hard decision to make. and there's always grace. If they're carrying guilt about that and all sorts of things, I'd want to pour on the grace of Jesus. So I think what I would like to say is that I wouldn't pour on condemnation at that point, nor would I pour on condemnation before either. But I think I would want them to know that I didn't think that ending the life would have been the right decision, but grace afterwards if they have, if that makes sense.
Let's just think about this a little bit more, because I think part of my own worry and struggle with this is, how do I, as a Christian person, as a Christian man, and as a pastor and everything else, how do we push out into the world on these issues? Because I'll take, for example, as I look across the waters to the USA, they do seem to have, it would appear, a much better infrastructure around the church, perhaps particularly, but also, it would vary from state to state, but there seems to be much more effort towards providing genuine alternatives to abortion. We're less developed here in the UK, and I wonder if actually part of our response as a Christian church is to say, actually, what we ought to be doing is not sort of finger wagging, saying this is what you should and shouldn't do, but that there's going to be better ways to handle trauma, mess, and unwanted pregnancies, and whether we're pushing into some of those things. Linda, do you want to comment on that?
I agree that, we seem to be a little bit behind, and that would definitely be some sort of solution and an offering here in the United Kingdom. The thing is, I as a person, naturally, I kind of always focus on solutions rather than the problem. So for me, yes, that's exactly what we should be doing. There should be some sort of, if I'm thinking now of any organisations, it's sort of a handful that would come to my mind, offering sort of good solutions, really. So maybe that is part of the answer. I think the other thing is we need to be talking about this. We need to be educating men as well as, because it always feels very loaded that this is all towards the female, when actually, as Tom pointed out, there is a sperm and an egg involved, So I think the conversation needs to be a bit wider, with men. I think in terms of, say, the perpetrators of any kind of sexual violence and in prisons, when you think about the programme that these men go through, maybe there needs to be an understanding and an education around bodily autonomy, the unborn child and all of that. In the prisons, from my understanding, a lot of it is addressing, well, you did wrong, and you do this course and hopefully you won't do wrong again. But it needs to be a bit more deeper than that, I feel, at that level. And maybe even before that stage, maybe at stages where, people can be educated before they do something like that, So I think there's a lot that can be done. Yeah.
Can I just offer one thought at this point? I'd be interested to hear if anyone's got any feedback for me on this one. But I know that often when we talk about legislation around abortion, it's men are spoken of as people who want to take advantage of women and force them to do things they don't want to do, namely have abortions. One of the things I wonder is actually if abortions are present and very easily and readily available, does that not make it easier on the consciences of men to follow through with promiscuous and violent acts of sexual rape or whatever else, because they know that on the other side of this act, there's contraceptive, there's morning after pills, there's widely available abortions. Should I do what I'm about to do, I can do all those things. Does not the availability of abortions actually play into the hands of men who want to abuse and take advantage of women? June?
I think perhaps for the ones that think far enough ahead, perhaps it does. My suspicion is, obviously I'm not a man, so I don't know, but my suspicion is that for a lot of men, it's just, that's perhaps just not even something that they need to think about, because, it literally is the woman that's left holding the baby. But
as a man, I can say to myself, well, I'm gonna carry out this act, wicked and horrific as it is, But I don't really need to worry about the fact that I'm going to produce a life out of this, because I would fully expect the person at the other end of that to just take the morning after pill or go through with an abortion.
Yeah, and that may well be what happens. But if somebody's in that mindset, is it a deterrent to say, oh, and they might get pregnant? Because there are plenty of men that will just wash their hands and say, well,
Whatever.
we're two adults.
Absolutely, because if they're prepared to do something awful to a woman, then I agree. I think they wouldn't really care about the baby either. I'm not sure that's what really going in their mind.
Oh, sorry, Tom. I wonder whether some of the pushback in terms of society, I'm a bit kind of concerned about Christians being so, in terms of campaigning against abortion. And abortion will always happen, until Jesus returns, whether it's legal or not. I wonder whether we'd be better placed as Christians to be targeting some of the causes, some of the root causes. So some of that, Mike, as you say, is about men's attitude towards sex being very easy, as in there's no consequence in this for me. I think that's definitely something about it, and seeing women as a source of pleasure rather than anything else. I think if we were campaigning about anything, I'd be really interested in Christians engaging more in terms of gender-based violence. What are we doing to target domestic abuse, coercive behaviour, manipulation? What are we doing to challenge the fact that we get, just a drop in the ocean of rapes are even reported to the police? Like less than 1% of rapes are reported to the police in the UK, and a tiny proportion of that, like a really, really tiny proportion, reach conviction. What are we doing to target that? If poverty is another huge thing which is raised, lots of women who have an abortion will be married and in a family situation, but just can't financially cope with another mouth to feed. What are we doing to target poverty? And I don't just mean let's set up a soup kitchen or let's set up another food bank. What are we doing to speak to our local MP? What are we using our vote to count? Rishi Sunak was filmed speaking to Tunbridge Wells, which is a very affluent area in Kent, about the fact that the Labour government had given out money to different local authorities based on deprivation. And he was gloating about the fact that he was undoing that to ensure that affluent areas got more money, taking it away from areas of deprivation. Are we happy that people do that? If we're saying that we really care about abortion and poverty is one of the areas that we're trying to target, and I'm not telling people how to vote, but I do think if we're saying it's really, really important to us, this issue of abortion and ensuring that these lives come to birth and fruition and flourish, what are we doing to ensure that happens? Because just campaigning against abortion isn't going to do it.
I just want to come in on the back of something June was saying and what you were saying, Mike, about men and their position in all of this. I think one of the things for me would also be, which we've not really talked about as yet, pornography drives a lot of things that happen against women. And for me personally, I would love to see both women and men, but young boys being educated in the value of what womanhood is all about, and that cherishing of the woman and all of that, at a very kind of young level. That's where I would like to see that, because I think that the way pornography has just grown as a thing in society, it just degrades and demeans how women are seen. And I wonder how much all of that is in the background, like a little, engine fueling a lot of the behaviour that we see.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. I'll just add. There's a really good website actually. It's not Christian, but it's called Porn Kills Love, and they've done a lot of research into pornography, which demonstrates that constant and regular usage of porn nearly always takes people on a more deviant pathway. So whereas it may start, quite relatively soft and all that sort of thing, using that language, it always tends towards harder, more victimizing, more violent, younger, more deviant in all sorts of ways. That's where that kind of addiction goes. And they've produced lots of resources and lots of evidence to sort of make that case. So that is, there's another sort of big area if we're thinking about gender-based violence and things like that. Well, it starts a long way back, and probably pornography has a lot to say about that.
I think even the way we depict relationships. Oh, sorry, Tom.
No. I think there's two things here. I mean, I think when you read out the statistics of abortion, Mike, earlier, you're almost sort of gasping at the numbers. And I think one of the things that we're discussing here is saying, well, look, it's obviously symptomatic of the state we've got to as a culture and a society that's even a requirement, that we can't bring up children in loving, stable. We've got all sorts of problems here. And I think Christians there's two aspects to our response. One is, obviously, we've got to deal with the reality of the world and how do we help the victims of all of this, and both the unborn lives and the women, etc. But how do we then address the underlying causes of it all, like we've also been highlighting? So I think the church needs to take both strategies and say, look, actually, the spread of the gospel, winning hearts and minds for Jesus, will have a radical transformation of society, as it always has done when the church and Christianity has grown in places. It's influenced almost everything. But that doesn't negate the fact that we do need to also do take certain steps to make society know, to look after the fallout and the victims of such situations. So I think there is two. We do need to have both in place. But I think even when coming back to that, I think that idea of bodily autonomy, that sometimes we've talked a lot about, obviously violent rape and pregnancies that have resulted from really horrible situations. But the argument about bodily autonomy and the rights of women and their bodies is also to do with the woman's, just purely the woman's right to choose, regardless of how the pregnancy happened. And I think we also need to acknowledge that, because when I hear those sorts of numbers, and I don't know the statistics, but partly I would say the regularity and availability of abortion. I'm not sure about what you were saying, Mike, about encourage men. I think what it can encourage potentially is the idea that could it be used as another form of contraceptive? The idea that we can have sexual freedom and bodily autonomy to do what we want with our bodies, women and men, etc. Because we have the right to choose, then that the consequences of what we do with it is easily removed. Now, I'm not saying, I don't know the statistics of what percentage of abortions are because of rape or abuse or pressure or economic circumstances. That might be quite a high percentage. But I wonder how many are out there as just literally the morning after pill, as in I made a mistake last night or whatever, and I didn't want to get pregnant, so let's take the morning after pill or something similar. And I think that would be, for me, a greater sort of problem to do surrounding this idea of bodily autonomy and the right to have an abortion.
I certainly think statistically, we're perhaps thinking that more abortions will happen from, the young, free and single who've, gone out, had a good night out and made a bit of a mistake, and now they need to make sure that there's not a, long-term repercussion. But I think statistically it's more women in settled relationships who are having abortions. That's not to say that that's not as a result of sexual violence, because we know most rapes happen in the home, most rapes happen as a result of somebody that the survivor knows. But I suppose I'm just challenging the idea that all or almost all abortions happen because, from somebody who's not in a relationship and has just hooked up with somebody. I think statistically it's much more likely to be somebody in a settled relationship.
Let's try and draw things to a close here. Closing comments. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up on this issue?
Can
Linda?
I just jump in?
Sorry. Go on, Ju.
There's an organisation that I came across called Rachel's Vineyard, and it ministers to women who have been traumatised as a result of abortion. And it does some. I heard a podcast with somebody talking about that ministry, and allows women the opportunity to say goodbye to the child that they didn't bring to full term. And there's some kind of restorative work around there. And we know that God's very much in the business of healing and restoration, and and so I'd recommend, organisations like that where the focus is on bringing that sense of healing and trying to support women through the trauma that they've experienced, that without the kind of, I suppose, without that condemnation. It's, just the opportunity to work through those things.
Thank you, June. Linda, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with June. I know that organisation, fantastic, and I highly recommend it. I think one of the other things when I was looking just through the Bible, just to get the Bible's perspective on all of these things, we know, don't we, that there were lots of killings of newborn babies, population control early on in the Bible and in the Gospels when King Herod wanted all the boys killed. So, they're trying to eradicate the Messiah. So these things were happening, way back then. Or we didn't call it abortion, but babies were being killed then. So this isn't something sort of, necessarily new for our society now. So it's a problem that's been there for a while. And I don't think the answer is that easy, or, we're still talking about those things all of these years later, just in a different way. That's all I would say.
Tom?
I think I think I would like to see us go to a place where Christians do need to advocate and argue and fight for the recovering the language of that unborn babies are humans, and that I think that society would radically change its position on or attitude to certain things if we stop trying to dehumanize unborn human lives, babies, languages around fetuses or clusters of cells, all that sort of thing. Because I understand why it's happened, but I think we need to start recognizing the value of human life, because I think as soon as we lose that, we're going to lose it all over the place, end of life and beginning of life. And I think it's just strictly just true, as we've seen, that I believe from the moment of conception, there is a soul, there is a spirit, a life that is eternally made in the image of God. So I think whatever, I don't know all the policies and outcomes. The world is a mess, and pastorally, we've got a lot of wisdom to understand all those areas. But if we lose that point, if we recover that point, I think that the whole thought process around it would change, and our decisions might change. And I think that's where we've lost a certain amount of this argument already. That's where I think. But the last thing I probably want to say as well is that, yes, I think abortion is against God's will, and I think it is a sin to take a life. I think we need to be very careful, though, as Christians, that also we don't attribute the motives of doing it, as we've discussed, aren't always just you're killing a. If we're using language around murder and killing and those sorts of things, it's different from an act of violence, anger against another human life. I think God sees that women make these choices for all sorts of reasons that aren't necessarily, aware, informed, not involving malice, etc., like that. So I think sometimes Christians need to be careful about how vitriolic we can get about this subject and use language that actually someone who's had an abortion would suddenly feel. You get what I'm saying. What I'm saying.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom, and thank you to June and Linda as well for coming on today and discussing this with us. I'll just issue the reminder again. Please do grab one of us or someone else you trust in the church to work some of these things through prayerfully with you if you'd like to. We certainly don't want you to come away from this episode feeling like your questions haven't been answered or your issues around this haven't been addressed. So please do grab someone. We'd love to pray with you. We'd love to talk things through with you as appropriate. But that's it. That's it for this week's Bible Live. We'll draw it to a close there. Let me tell you about next week. Next week, we're going to be thinking about why did God make a world that could go wrong in the first place? It's a question we're often asked when we're thinking about Bible, when we're thinking about creation. So we're getting back into Genesis 3, 1-13. Why? Why in the first place did the Lord make a world that could go wrong and produce the kind of outcomes that we've been talking about today. That's next week. That's next Thursday on Bible Live. Until then, it'd be nice to get away from all the panelists on today's episode, if we could get away. Great to have you all with us. And we'll see you again next time.